So let me start by telling you my name is Debbie Fox Davis. I'm the Executive Director of HD Reach, and we're glad that you can be with us here tonight. This is the 7th webinar of our 2022 education series. And this webinar is being recorded, as are all of our educational materials, and everything is being hosted on our website at hdreach.org. You're always welcome to go back and rewatch a webinar or send a link to a friend if you know it's a topic that they're interested in. Tonight's webinar is going to be all about Elise Daniel and her presentation about fertility in HD. Elise is an embryologist known to many on TikTok as Elise the Embryologist. She is also a member of the HD Reach Board of Directors. And if you have questions for Elise during the presentation, please put them in the chat and we will save time at the end of the presentation to ask Elise all of your questions. And before we get started, I do really want to say thank you to the sponsors that are making our education series possible. And thanks to Teva, Genentech, Neurocrine, Sage, PTC, Unicure, and Wave. And now, Elise, I turn it over to you and thank you for being here.
Awesome. Yes, I'm so excited to be here. As Debbie said, my name is Elise. I'll just do a quick welcome about me if I can get my presentation started here. All right, let's see if this is going to work. All right, well, it was working. Let me escape and try again. All right, there we go. Cool. All right, so my name is Elise. As Debbie said, I'm an embryologist, so that means that I work in the IVF lab, creating and growing embryos for patients who are trying to conceive or grow their families. I graduated from NC State in 2018 in a degree in genetics with a minor in biotech. And then I started right out of college in the IVF lab and trained my way into embryology. And I really saw a need for more education, directed towards patients and others on what we really do in the lab and why we do it. So I started my TikTok account and social media accounts back in 2021. And it's been a really cool journey. I have been doing it now for a year and a half or so. So it's been really fun to be able to share the information and what I do on a daily basis to, the masses. And I joined the HD Reach board back in November of 2021. So it's hasn't been very long, but I've really been enjoying my time on the board as part of some other, organizations and things. And it's been really a fun time. And I've learned a lot because while my background is in genetics, I didn't particularly know everything about Huntington's disease, and I still don't, but I've learned a lot, and it's been a really fun group to work with. So in terms of what we are doing today, or talking about today, why does my presentation not want to go? Seems like every slide just wants to stop there. There we go. Alrighty, so in terms of topics today, we're gonna just go over some IVF basics and then talk about how Huntington's disease, which I've just called HD, it's a little bit easier to say, how that's passed genetically. We're gonna talk about the IVF process for those with or at risk for HD, and then we'll go over some non-disclosure testing for IVF for those with HD, and then wrap up with the implications of Roe v. Wade on IVF, and those with HD who are pursuing IVF, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A. So the basics. IVF stands for in vitro fertilization. That is where we are stimulating a patient with hormonal medication to make their ovaries produce more eggs. We're then surgically removing those eggs and combining them with either partner or donor sperm and culturing those embryos in the lab most of the time until day 5, 6, or 7. And then there are a handful of things we can do with them at that point. Those things being freezing, embryo biopsy, fresh transfers, and so on. And in particular, those with HD are likely going to be doing the biopsy and freeze route. The biggest thing to point out with IVF is that it doesn't guarantee a baby, even if you aren't doing IVF for infertility reasons. So even if you're completely fertile and you're doing IVF for, say, gender selection or Huntington's, doesn't necessarily guarantee a baby. So how is Huntington's disease, or HD, passed from parent to child? So Huntington's is an autosomal dominant disease, meaning that you only need one copy of the allele to have the disorder. It's not sex-linked, so it affects both men and women equally. Because you see symptoms later on in life, oftentimes people with Huntington's have already had children before they know they have the disease. And I will say that is not as common as it used to be, but it's still oftentimes you start seeing symptoms after you've already had children. So if you as a parent have HD, your chance of having a child with Huntington's is 50% for each child. And that, I want to make it very clear that it's independent for each child. So the chance does not increase or decrease if the first child has Huntington's or doesn't have Huntington's. The chance of having a child with Huntington's, if you have Huntington's, is independent of the status of your previous child. And this is a little Punnett square that shows how it's passed. So the red X there is the allele that carries Huntington's. That is the parent with Huntington's, and you can see how half of those children will have Huntington's while the other half will not. So that is the chance every time you have a child when you have Huntington's disease. So IVF for those with or at risk for Huntington's, really the biggest thing here is PGTM testing, which does require IVF. So PGTM stands for pre-implantation genetic testing for a monogenetic disorder, which is a really long name. So I'm glad they've shortened it to PGTM. But that is really what is needed for us to be able to determine if an embryo has Huntington's disease. And so another thing to keep in mind is IVF PGTM doesn't allow us to fix these embryos or prevent them from inheriting HD. What it does is it allows us to screen the embryos. So we can't fix it, we can't prevent it, but we can see which embryos are going to have Huntington's and which embryos are not. So it allows us to choose the embryo that will not inherit Huntington's disease. So it is kind of an in-depth process in terms of doing IVF and PGTM. It does require genetic markers, and that is a blood test or blood work that's taken from the parents. It allows us to make genetic markers specifically for that couple to do the testing. And that's not actually done in the clinic. That is done at a genetic testing company, but we work in conjunction with them to create those markers. And the last thing to point out in terms of IVF with HD, at least on this slide, is that it does require embryo biopsy, which is what's being shown in this picture right here. And that requires a subsequent embryo transfer for FET. So that means the process is a little bit longer than, maybe more traditional IVF patients. So it's going to be a longer timeline, which I'll show on the next slide in terms of, how long is that going to take. In this picture, where you can see that the pipette on the right there is taking some cells from the embryo. That is what we're doing when we're doing embryo biopsy. We are taking 5 to 5 to 10 cells from the embryo and sending those cells off to the genetic testing company, and they are able to amplify that DNA from those cells and determine, one, does it have normal chromosomes in terms of the number of chromosomes, and two, with PGTM testing, it allows us to test specifically for Huntington's, and they're able to give us that information as to which embryos have Huntington's and which don't. All right, so this is a little timeline here of, you know, your expectations in terms of how long it will take to go from initial consult to, you know, finding out whether you're pregnant or not. It is a quite long process, and that's why I like to show this, so patients have an expectation when they're going in for their initial consult as to how long it's going to take. I think there is some misinformation on, or just, you know, an expectation that IVF is quick, and that you'll be able to get your transfer quick, and that's not typically the case. So most of the time, most clinics are booked out a few weeks, so it can sometimes take 4 to 6 weeks to even get that initial consult. After that initial consult, especially for those with Huntington's, there's a lot of diagnostic testing that's involved in terms of creating those markers, diagnostic testing for you and your partner, meaning a semen analysis, egg quality testing, hormone testing, all of that sort of thing, and prepping for IVF. That means ordering meds, learning how to mix those medications, learning how to inject those medications, and planning out on a calendar when all this stuff is going to happen. That typically takes 4 to 6 weeks. The actual IVF stimulation, this is when the patient is taking medications, injecting themselves with medications to force their ovaries to produce more eggs. That's typically a 10 to 13 day process, depending on the person and how they're reacting to those medications. At that point, we are then ready for egg retrieval. Your eggs have been grown. They're ready to be taken out surgically. And so when we do that process, for the patient, it only takes 30 minutes or so. It's very fast. But in terms of what happens in the lab, they're in culture for up to 7 days. 7 days is typically the max. And then we are biopsying them and sending them out to genetic testing. Usually it takes 4 to 6 weeks to get those embryo biopsy results. And that is, PGTM testing takes longer than traditional testing because we're using those specific markers. It's very patient specific. So that takes a little bit longer than some of the other testing. So we usually estimate 4 to 6 weeks to get those results back. In that time, sometimes patients are prepping for a transfer, meaning that they're preparing their body to get ready for an embryo transfer. But typically in cases with, you know, where we're doing PGTM, we want to make sure we have those results back before we have a patient start preparation for an FET, because if they don't have any normal embryos or embryos that are, you know, available to be transferred, then we may have to start the process over again. And then we've wasted some time and some money prepping for something that we can't quite do. But hopefully we have some normal embryos. And in that case, we can do some things somewhat simultaneously. And we're prepping for FET. And that is, FET stands for frozen embryo transfer. And that is where we are putting the embryo back into the uterus in hopes that the patient is getting pregnant. That preparation process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks is, you know, you gotta just keep that one in your mind, because that's the usual for most of these things is 4 to 6 weeks. And then once we finally do the transfer itself takes maybe 30 minutes as well. And then most patients are knowing whether the transfer was successful within 10 to 14 days after that transfer. Some things to keep in mind is that the timeline is very dependent on the clinic. So, you know, some move a little faster, some move a little slower, but this is kind of a general timeline of what you can expect for doing the whole process. All right, so I'm gonna do this again. Seems like it. There we go. All righty. Non-disclosure testing for those who are wanting to do IVF. So it is completely up to you on whether you want to, how much you want to disclose and how much you want to keep unknown. So IVF, with PGTM testing is an option for those who don't want to disclose their own status in terms of whether they have Huntington's or not. So we don't have to know your status to do IVF with PGTM. In these cases, the results of the parents' testing as well as the embryos testing is only known to a handful of staff at the genetic testing company, not in the clinic. Typically, we don't know the status. Anyone in the clinic, none of us know the status of the parent or the embryos. We are typically told which embryos are good for transfer. And there can be a variety of reasons why embryos aren't suitable for transfer. So if you only have 5 out of 10 embryos that are suitable, that doesn't automatically tip us off that you have Huntington's. There are a variety of reasons why embryos aren't able to be transferred. There are embryos that have an abnormal number of chromosomes. So disorders like trisomy 21, which is Down syndrome, trisomy 18, Klinefelter syndrome, Turner syndrome, those are all things that happen during the growth of the embryo, not something that is passed down from parent to child. So embryos are not suitable for transfer for those reasons as well. So it doesn't like tip us off or anything if only one of the embryos is able to be transferred or 2 of the embryos, things like that. And really that discussion on what you want to keep disclosed or what you want to keep secret is a conversation that you would have with your physician, likely in that initial consult. Hey, we don't want to, I don't know my status. I don't want to know my status, but I may want to know the sex of the embryos. We can really, there's a lot of ways to make it personalized as to, what you want to know and what you don't want to know. We can keep pretty much everything under wraps if you prefer. That includes how many embryos you have, the sex of those embryos, all of that are things that we don't have to disclose to you. And some of those things we don't even know ourselves. Like we can tell the genetic testing company, hey, the patient doesn't want to know the sex of their embryos and they don't want us to know either. So they can omit that information to us. And so then we don't know either. Most of the time in terms of sex selection, patients like for us to know, but sometimes they don't want to know. So then, when they find out that they're pregnant, we can tell them early instead of having to get blood work and things like that. So it really depends on what you want and what you feel is most comfortable. And that's something you talk to about with your physician. Now, there are some drawbacks of IVF with non-disclosure testing. So the biggest one being that if you don't know your status and you are negative, then we will have done all of the IVF for you and your partner, and it may not have been needed. And that's a big one to consider because it is an expensive process and does take a long time. And if the partner who produces sperm is the partner who is at risk for Huntington's, the partner who is undergoing all of the IVF procedures, injections and things, didn't have to go through all of those things. And they are somewhat invasive procedures, take a lot of time. So it's something that you want to consider if you're considering non-disclosure testing with IVF. The other thing to keep in mind is that probe creation often requires blood samples from extended family. I spelled insurance wrong. That's okay. So there are often times where we have to get blood work from extended family to be able to create the genetic markers because it's been passed down from another family member and things like that. And sometimes that can be hard to do. Your family members may have passed at that point. They may not be willing to give blood. They may not be in a location that's easily accessible. All of those things are something to keep in mind. It's not always the case that we need an extended family, but it oftentimes is. So it's something we like patients to think about if they're considering non-disclosure testing. The other thing is, like I mentioned before, IVF does not guarantee a baby. So there are times, or guarantee a normal embryo even, or an embryo at all. So it may be possible that you require multiple rounds of IVF to get a normal embryo or to get an embryo or to get the number of embryos that you want, depending on your family vision. So if patients are, planning a larger family, we do like for patients to have 2 or 3 embryos per live birth. So if you're expected, if you want 2 children, you want a patient to have 4 to 6 embryos to meet that goal of having a live birth. So those are some things to keep in mind as well. The last thing is that IVF is quite expensive, and insurance companies haven't always gotten on board in terms of covering IVF. So we want to make sure patients are aware of the expense that goes into doing IVF and PGT-M testing and all that goes with it. There's a lot of traveling involved to and from the clinic while you're in the middle of stimulation. In that 10 to 13 days, you're in the clinic almost every other day. So it's something to keep in mind in terms of your work schedule and things like that. There's a lot of things to keep in mind. I just like to make sure patients are as informed as they can be when they're making a decision. All right, some of the implications of Roe v. Wade on IVF. I know this is a big topic and one that I've covered pretty extensively on my social media. So if it's ever something you want to check out just in general, feel free to do that. The biggest thing, which I said everything is the biggest thing today, to keep in mind is that every state is going to have different regulations. So it can be very difficult to predict what will happen or what could happen because every state is going to be different. But there will be implications because I really strongly believe that there will be states where there will be impacts of having Roe being overturned on IVF. So there are some other countries, Germany, Italy used to be more strict. So those countries that are stricter or have been stricter in the past, a lot of the states that are going to be implementing some of these stricter laws are going to be looking at those states or looking at those countries, and modeling their laws after them. And in some of those states, some of these procedures aren't allowed at all. So embryo biopsy isn't allowed, which means that we couldn't do PGT-M at all if we're not allowed embryo biopsy. We may not be allowed to do to freeze embryos, to discard embryos, and even do ICSI. There may be a limit on the number of eggs we can inject at a time. And for patients who are doing PGT-M, the numbers game is huge because there's already going to be a certain number of embryos that aren't going to be normal from the get-go. So it's definitely something that is going to have a widespread impact on a lot of patients. Access to care is also a really important aspect of this. There are already a lot of patients in states. Thankfully, North Carolina has a good amount of fertility clinics, but in some of the more rural areas and rural or Midwest states, they may have one clinic in their area. And if that state is a state that's going to be have restrictions on IVF, they're going to have a hard time finding access to care. They may have to travel out of state for care, which means that costs are going to increase. And then the states that are allowing IVF are going to have a higher volume of patients, which is also a problem. There are some concerns that physicians may consider moving to a more liberal state if their state is not going to be allowing IVF. So, the people in that state may have less access to care than they used to. And like I said, the full implications are really hard to predict because each state will have different laws in place. So just some things to think about for sure. And it's not necessarily the most fun topic, but it's something we have to think about. And I know a lot of clinics, especially in this area and all over the country, are already thinking about how this is going to change things for their patients. How can they mitigate that change and make it so they're still able to provide comprehensive care for their patients? So ultimately, the goal in IVF and fertility care is to provide the patient, with the knowledge that allows them to make an informed decision. Ultimately, we can't make that decision for you. We want to make sure that you have the information that you feel like you need to make an informed decision. There's so much information that goes into IVF. A lot of it is very technical and can be hard to understand. And again, it's very expensive. And so we want patients to make sure patients have as much information as they can before they make a decision. something that one of the physicians I've worked with in the past always used to say is you really have to balance your head, your heart, and your wallet. And that can be really challenging. And really our goal is to guide you along the way and give you things to think about while you're trying to balance those things. So hopefully this was super informative. I'm a very rambly person, so hopefully I didn't ramble on too much, but keep it nice and short and sweet. And we can wrap everything up with a Q&A. So I am open to taking any questions that any of y'all have. I'm happy to go over anything else that I already talked about. If you had a question about a previous slide, I'm happy to go back and discuss anything there. Yeah, and I hope you all got something out of that.
Hey, Elise, thank you so much. I learned a lot. I always do. But I also know that there's some questions that have been coming to us even before the presentation. So I thought while people were putting any questions in the chat, I would ask some of these. So one question somebody asked was because they're nervous about what's going to happen where they live and with Roe being overturned. And they asked, can I move my eggs to a state that is safeguarding reproductive rights?
You can. So thankfully, transportation of embryos and gametes in general has gotten much better than it used to be. So there are a lot of options in terms of how to ship your embryos, where you can ship them. There are a lot more long-term storage facilities out there that all they do is cryo storage. So they're very well equipped to just store your gametes and your embryos. Although I have heard of, now I don't know how each state is doing things. I've heard of other clinicians saying that the embryos that they received from another state, the state was trying to tell them that they had to still transfer them because they were created in that state. I don't know how some of that stuff plays out legally. I would think that moving them would mitigate that issue. But it's really hard to tell it. And some of the issue comes with clinicians who are scared. They don't want to get in trouble. And so they're pausing things and consulting with lawyers and things like that to make sure that they're still able to provide care, but aren't risking their licenses and things like that. But I would think that moving your eggs or embryos or sperm to a state that isn't going to have restrictions would be a workaround for that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that's been posed is, does IVF pose any long-term health effects on my body?
So this is a hard one because IVF, while it seems like it's been around for a long time, it really hasn't. I think the first IVF baby, I think is like 40 or something. So really in terms of medical care, it's a relatively new science. And so some of the long-term effects, studies that are out there are only so old because there aren't that many, IVF hasn't been going on for that long. So the studies that we have now show that there aren't any long-term effects to you or your IVF baby, but with time comes more research. So I can't say for sure, no, there's no problems, but research currently shows that there are no complications in terms of increased risk for those who have undergone IVF or have an IVF baby. But the research is still coming out. What IVF does in terms of the medications is it recruits the follicles that would have otherwise been reabsorbed and lost by the body. So it doesn't, I think another misconception is that you lose eggs if you're doing IVF or donating your eggs or things like that. But really all we're doing is capturing those eggs that would have been lost anyway, because typically our body is only releasing one, maybe two, if you have, fraternal twins, most of the time one. So we're capturing all those other eggs that would have been otherwise lost. So, research is showing that it's not having any long-term effects, but, as more research comes out, it'll help add to that, to that theory that there's no long-term complications.
Great. So Elise, we did get another question in the chat. And I'm going to read it for you. She said, "This is kind of specific, so it's okay if you can't answer it. We have one embryo that when sent for genetic testing, it did not have enough of a material to be tested. We just recently reached out to the clinic to thaw and rebiopsy. How bad is this for the embryo? Being thawed and refrozen, then eventually thawed again if it is normal. Thank you."
Yeah, so that does happen. Genetic testing is great, but it's not always perfect. And sometimes we don't have enough cells that make it into the tube. It's a very small tube, very small amount of cells. So sometimes they're not able to amplify the DNA enough or have enough DNA to amplify to be able to get results. So sometimes we'll get, incomplete results and things like that, no reads and no results. And we are able to thaw embryos, rebiopsy them, and refreeze them. This is definitely something you'll want to, talk to your doctor about in terms of being counseled. But some things we're looking for when we're considering doing this is the grade of the embryo. The better the grade, the more likely it is to survive all of the things that we're putting it through. So if there's an embryo that was already borderline when we biopsied it the first time, we may say, hey, this may not be the best candidate for rebiopsy because it was already a little bit borderline to begin with. Grades are often based on the number of cells. And so if we're taking 5 to 10 cells from an embryo that has 100 cells, that's much different than taking 5 to 10 cells from an embryo that has 50 cells. So that's something to keep in mind is the grade. Now, ultimately, it does create more stress for the embryo. We're putting it through more things than we otherwise would have. But I've seen lots of embryos survive thaws, survive rebiopsies. Survival rates of embryo thawing is really high. Most of the time, most clinics have a survival rate of at least 95%. Most of them are closer to 98 or 99%. So technology has gotten so good that we are able, it's very rare that we lose an embryo, but the risk is there. And the risk does increase if we are thawing it multiple times and refreezing it multiple times. So that risk is always there, and it does increase if we're, doing something more than once.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you, Elise. And there was one more, if that's okay. Would the at-risk parent status be recorded somewhere when doing non-disclosure testing? I would be concerned about anonymity.
That is a really good question. And so I've only had one case that I have seen of a patient going through IVF with that didn't know their status and wanted to keep that, did not want to disclose that status. I am not sure if it's physically written somewhere, but there will be people who know the status because they have to be able to do the procedures. In terms of having it written, I'm not 100% sure. That's a question I would have to ask the genetic testing company. But when I met with them to talk about this specific patient, they are very familiar with it because they do it much more than clinics do, because they're seeing patients from all over the place. And they were very confident that it's something they do all the time. The patients are counseled the same, regardless of their status. The counselors themselves don't actually know your status. They're counseling you not knowing what your status is. And she told me it's around 4 people who end up knowing the status of the patient. And like I said, I'm not sure about whether it's physically written somewhere or on a document. That part I don't know. I'm so sorry. Am I back? Yes. That part I don't know, but that was something we could easily ask them. It's typically a quick email. I could say, hey, is this end up written down somewhere in some sort of documentation? And we would be able to check that for you before we started the process. That was a very long-winded answer, but yeah. I think you're muted, Debbie.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I was just saying those are great questions. And, if anybody else has questions, please put them in the chat. I thought it was a great answer too, because I'd never thought of that, but that's a really good point. Some people have asked, once you get pregnant through IVF, is the pregnancy considered high risk or is it considered a normal pregnancy?
That's a great question. So unfortunately, all IVF pregnancies are considered high risk, even if the patient is very healthy and so is the baby. Because it was conceived that way, it's considered high risk, which I think there are some clinicians working to change that, because not every IVF pregnancy is high risk. Pregnancy in general is high risk for you as a person, but IVF pregnancies compared to typical pregnancies, if you're a healthy person, is not always the case. But technically right now you are considered a high risk patient or high risk pregnancy if you have conceived via IVF.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. And then somebody else wanted to know, is it common to have multiples when you go through IVF?
So this is a really common misconception, which I always find very interesting. And I think a lot of it comes from IVF's history, and there is a history of having multiples. But as the science has gotten better, we're better able to predict which embryos will make healthy pregnancies, so we don't have to transfer as many. Usually when patients are getting multiples, it's because they're transferring multiple embryos. Nowadays, with genetic testing and being able to extend culture out to 5 to 7 days, we're transferring one embryo. It's very rare that we're transferring more than one embryo. And the risk of multiples when transferring one embryo, so meaning you would have identical twins, is only like 1% higher than the natural population. So it's very unlikely that you're getting it with multiples unless you're transferring more than one embryo, which is really uncommon with technology having progressed to where it is now.
Good to know. I didn't know that. I thought it was common too.
Yeah.
So all of this is great information. If there's any other questions, just put them in the chat right now.
So
otherwise,
sorry, Debbie. There was a point brought up in the chat, and I'll say it now. It's just wanted to say that donor eggs or sperm are also an option for folks that don't want to know their status.
Yes. And that is very true. So donor eggs and donor sperm, we know their status because they have to do genetic testing to be able to donate their gametes. So that is an option for those who are not wanting to know their status, but still wanting to try, still want to conceive, and not have a risk of having their child with Huntington's. So donor eggs and donor sperm are an option. The donor sperm route, it's very unbalanced in terms of what is easier. Donor sperm is traditionally much easier because oftentimes you can do home inseminations, because the reason you're using a donor gamete isn't necessarily because you can't conceive, it's because you're wanting to avoid something. So using donor sperm is oftentimes an easier route than using donor eggs. It's also typically a little bit cheaper. Donor sperm runs about $1,000 a vial, whereas donor eggs for a lot of six can be 15 to 20 grand. Plus you have to do, transfer and things like that. So it's a much more expensive process, but it is an option, and one that can be talked about in an initial consult, depending on what your family vision is. A lot of times that initial consult, we want to know what your vision is. What are you envisioning when you're thinking about your future family? Are you envisioning a large family? Are you envisioning a small family? Are you envisioning donor embryos? Hey, I'm not really concerned on if they're genetically related to me, but I still want to carry a child. Donor embryos is an option. Hey, my partner is at risk for Huntington's. We are open to donor gametes. All of those things we're finding out in that initial consult because we want to guide our care to what a patient wants, ultimately, what they're envisioning, what their comfortability is with certain things. There are some patients who, donor gametes is a hard no for them, or some patients who are open to it but not open to gestational care and things like that. So we find out those things in that initial consult and can guide your care based on what you are wanting.
This is great information, Elise. And you obviously are very good at presenting all of this and asking all of these questions.
I try.
And getting to the heart of it, what your clients want. Are all clinics equally able to ask all these questions and understand where an HD family may be coming from? Or are there do people look for certain types of clinics?
Yeah, so I will say it's definitely not always the case. You do want to find a clinic that's a good fit for you, which may not always be an option. I always like to mention that there are places where patients don't have the resources to go to other clinics, and that's really unfortunate. And I see those patients out there. I know there are patients out there who don't have a choice in where they go for care. But patients who do have a choice, there are some things you want to consider. I have a free guide on my website on choosing a clinic, some things to look out for, some red flags, some things to consider when you're choosing a clinic. Ultimately, when you go in for that initial consult, you want to have some things in mind that you value. What do you value about maybe some medical care you've had in the past? What were some things you didn't like, how you were treated or how you were cared for? What are some things that are really important to you? Cost may be something that's really important to you. Cost may not be the most important thing to you. Those are some things to have in mind when you're going into a clinic, so you can have those things in the front of your brain when you're having that conversation, when you're feeling the atmosphere of the clinic, because you're going to be spending a lot of time and money there. And so you want to make sure you're feeling cared for and getting what you want out of that clinic. So not every clinic is the same. Not every lab is the same. And so I created that guide to help patients determine, what is a good fit for them in terms of a clinic and what isn't a good fit, and some things to think about before you have that initial consult. So that's free to check out on my website if you ever want to look into it.
That's fantastic. Thank you for making all of this information available to families out there with HD. And I just want to let everybody know that we are recording this. It'll take us about a week to get it all edited and pretty and up on our website. And then we invite you to come back, watch it again, take notes, and definitely share it if you know of other people who are considering IVF or just have questions about how this all works. That's what it's there for. There's resources to help make this a little bit easier for you. We do have another webinar coming up in just a couple weeks on September 20th. And it's going to be with Dr. Bob Trustman, who is going to do a presentation on suicide prevention and mental health. And this will be during Suicide Prevention Month. So we welcome you to sign up for free, register, go to our website at hdreach.org, and you can register and attend this free webinar. We welcome you to come back anytime and ask any questions, and we'll always work on getting you the information. Obviously, we don't know everything, but we know a lot of really smart people who do, and that's what we're here for.
And Debbie, did you want to mention the grant that we had talked about? There was an IVF grant for those with Huntington's.
Yes. Kelly, is that something you can put in the chat? We had the link.
Yes, I'll send it right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, so definitely check that out. If you or someone you know is wanting to do IVF and they are at risk or have Huntington's, check that out, because as I've said multiple times, I don't try to say, like, I don't want to scare, I'm not trying to scare anyone, but I want people to have a realistic expectation when they go into considering this. And so it's not a cheap endeavor, and there are grants out there to help with the cost, and this one specifically for those with Huntington. So it's definitely worth checking out or sharing with a friend who is considering it, because that's an awesome thing that they're offering. I'm so glad that's a resource.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for reminding me, because this is a great foundation, and this is what their goal is to help families who are impacted by HD and, are interested in making babies that are healthy. And that's what they're there for. So thank you for bringing that up. And the link is in the chat, and please go there, because they do have scholarships and grants to help make it a little more affordable.
Yeah. Awesome. Hopefully we're working on getting insurance coverage. That's a big push for a lot of people in the field is getting more coverage for care. So if you ever see laws coming by, check them out, support them, because we're trying to get, there's only 19 states in the US that mandate that their employers provide fertility coverage for their patients. We really would like that to be 50. So there are a lot of state related things. North Carolina is not a state that mandates fertility coverage. So we would like to change that. If you ever see any of that, come across your path, give it a little bit of support.
So that's a good point too. I'm living in Colorado right now, and I just read in the news that as of, I think, January 1st, large employers are mandated, will be mandated to provide coverage for fertility. Would families undergoing IVF for reasons of because they have HD, would they still qualify? Do you know if
I
they would be
think a lot of them do. So in my experience with patients who are in North Carolina who have coverage, because there still are some, it's not mandated, but there's still some companies that offer it. There's something that's called prior authorization. So some insurance companies require us to get authorization first for the coverage before they can undergo treatment. And all of that stuff is included. So we would say, hey, the reason that they're doing this is because of this reason. This is why it should be covered, that sort of thing. So we can oftentimes vouch for our patients and advocate for them to receive coverage. And we've been able to have that be successful for a lot of patients, even having them ask their employer, hey, we're willing to vouch for you. If you want to go to your HR department and say, hey, this is why it should be covered, we will vouch for you. And, we're there to support you and advocate for you in getting that coverage. And we've been able to make that work for a handful of patients. And Resolve.org is a fantastic organization just for general fertility care. They did a study, maybe 2 years ago at this point, that showed that adding fertility coverage did not increase the employer costs for like 98% of employers. So we're like, well, why aren't you offering it if it's not costing you any more money? So oftentimes we're able to say, hey, go to your HR, see if it's an option, and maybe something they didn't even think about, and it doesn't cost them any more money. So we're really advocating for that at this point, because we really believe that all patients should have access to it. So thankfully we're working on it. And oftentimes if they have coverage, Huntington's and other genetic disorders are able, those patients are able to still get coverage, which is great.
That's great to know. That's good. I mean, there's sometimes it doesn't feel hopeful, but there is a lot. And I guess if you're ever job hunting and, look at the benefits and ask some of these questions and find out and let employers know that this is important. And, hopefully we can do a groundswell from the bottom up and get it covered.
It's a very hard topic to talk about, especially those of you who are at risk or have Huntington's. Huntington's alone is very difficult to talk about it and maybe talk about with your family or your employer. And infertility is slowly starting to break away from that. It's becoming less taboo and more talked about, which ultimately is able to get us, advance us in some of these things that we're trying to work towards. So, keep it out there and keep it aware. Same thing with Huntington's. Let's, we gotta work together to get some change happening. So.
Well, thank you for everything you're doing, Elise. This is fantastic. It's been a lot of great information. I won't be surprised if we get more questions that come to us, and I hope I can reach out to you to ask them.
Send them along. I'm always open to answer questions privately, however you like. I'm open to that. You can send me a DM on Instagram or TikTok, or reach out to me on my website or email. I'm always open to answering questions or providing support or resources to anyone who needs it.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everyone out there who is watching and is part of this HD community, for all of your support and for learning and educating yourself and helping to educate others and advocate for the best things possible. So I thank you. And I wish everyone a really good night.
Yeah. Thanks y'all for coming out.